Hi, welcome to America Uncovered. I'm your host, Chris Chappell. On today's show, we're going to cover an easy, simple topic: slavery. I think we all have in our minds some kind of idea of what slavery in America used to look like. Well, guess what? That's not a picture of the antebellum South. It's actually a picture from a modern-day American prison. But slavery is illegal in the United States, right? Right. The 13th Amendment says neither slavery nor involuntary servitude shall exist within the United States. Except there's this one little thing. It's okay if it's punishment for a crime. And that one little exception is why some people say slavery is alive and well in the prison systems in the United States. The United States has a lot of people in prison. The U.S. has 5% of the world's population, but 25% of the world's prisoners. The other 75% of us are just prisoners to our smartphones. You know it's true. You're probably using your smartphone right now. The U.S. has 1.5 million people in state and federal prisons, and 750,000 more in our jails. 1 in 4 adults in this country has a criminal record. That's more than the number of people with bachelor's degrees. But they don't end up with crushing student loan debt, so you win some, you lose some. And prisoners are often put to work to make everything from mattresses to road signs to goat cheese for Whole Foods. Hold on, if prison labor made the goat cheese at Whole Foods, why is it still so expensive? But as for prisoners in the U.S., a disproportionate number of them are black. Why that is, well, that would take a whole other episode. Suffice it to say, there are even more black Americans in prisons than whites, despite being a much smaller share of the national population. And when you see, for example, black prisoners working in the fields of a former plantation-turned-prison, like in this documentary Angola for Life, well, it's not surprising that some people compare prison labor to slavery. Okay, more than some. In fact, 2016 saw the largest prison strike in U.S. history. This is slavery, said one convicted murderer unironically. But he's wrong. You can't call it slavery. Technically, prisoners get paid for their work, although it's often less than $1 an hour. But technically, that's not slavery. Except in 5 states where most prisoners don't get paid at all. But according to Prison Policy Initiative, prison labor is worth about $2 billion a year. So you might be wondering, how is this legal? Well, it's that little exception in the 13th Amendment, that's how. And according to the Crime Control Act of 1990, all convicted inmates must work. Although there are plenty of exceptions too, like medical or security concerns, or if they're taking classes. So actually, it's a big exception. Only about half of inmates end up doing work. There are 2 main types of prison labor. One is when a prisoner does work inside the prison, jobs like mopping or cooking. They make, on average, 20 cents an hour. It's mainly a way for prisons to cut down on costs and give inmates something to do. The second type of prison labor is where they make stuff for the outside world, like artisanal goat cheese. That's where things get a little different. Actually, prisoners didn't used to do that kind of work. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, prison labor was largely regulated or prohibited due in part to efforts by labor unions to prevent competition with low-paid inmates. In 1940, Congress banned interstate commerce in prison-made goods. So prison labor involving the world outside prison was pretty limited. But then, this creates a problem. What do inmates do with their time? According to one criminal defense attorney, when people think of the horrors of prison, they think of abuse by guards and assaults by other inmates. But the numbing, soul-eroding boredom that comes with incarceration is another major element of the dehumanization. And this is why there are those that argue prison labor is not a modern form of slavery, but in fact a good thing. A lot of people who end up in prison come from poverty and have never held down a job a day in their life. Learning how to do that, even if in prison, is a big deal. And that's according to Crispino Kenyatta Leal. He's a former inmate at San Quentin and founding member of The Last Mile. Last Mile was founded by several former inmates to provide jobs for current inmates that teach them skills that will help them succeed when they get out. Kenyatta Leal credits the carpentry, plumbing, and electrical work he did in prison with his success finding jobs in the tech industry after he got out. So this is the other side of the prison labor story. Work can play a big role in rehabilitation. According to the Congressional Research Service, over 95% of the prison population today will be released at some point in the future. But if you're concerned about criminals pouring back out onto the streets, don't worry. 2/3 of them will be rearrested within 3 years of getting released. That's actually horribly depressing. When a former inmate winds up back in prison, it's called recidivism. But jobs in prison can make a difference. This analysis by New York University found that vocational programs, in other words, programs that provide job training, correlate with 20% less recidivism. Prisoners who work in prison once released are also much more likely to get employed, and they earn more when they do. That is, if anyone wants to hire them. Former prison inmate Chandra Bozelko, who now writes for The Guardian and The Washington Post, writes that prison work is more than a wage. It's an expression of humanity, and that is especially true in prison. To even consider ridding our prisons of inmate work assignments is dehumanizing. But an inmate is not going to get a lot of useful job skills from doing menial jobs like mopping floors. So, in 1934, the U.S. government created the Federal Prison Industries, also known as UNICOR. It provides vocational training and offers a voluntary industrial work program. These are jobs inside the prison that mimic real-life jobs. There are about 60,000 inmates participating in UNICOR. In 2015, UNICOR brought in almost $500 million in sales. Then there's the Prison Industry Enhancement Program, or PI. It was started in 1979. It allowed private firms to hire inmates. Again, voluntary. But wait, wasn't the whole prison labor thing stopped because labor unions were concerned low-paid prisoners would outcompete their members? Not quite. The law required prisoners to be paid the local minimum wage so they wouldn't be competitive against unions. And local labor union officials must be consulted and must agree that local non-convict labor is unaffected and that goods produced in the prison must be from an industry that isn't experiencing local unemployment. So these inmates are getting paid minimum wage? Not really. Inmates in UNICOR and PI still end up making only pennies per hour. That's because most of their wages are taken by the prison to cover the costs of imprisonment, which would otherwise have to be covered by taxpayers. In fact, U.S. taxpayers already spend about $80 billion a year on prisons. It's an average of $30,000 per prisoner per year. Though in New York City, it's $168,000 per prisoner. Wow, even the cost of staying in prison in New York is crippling. There's no escape. So the government takes the majority of prisoners' wages to cover costs. As Chandra Bozelko points out, since only half of prisoners work, that leaves at least 1.3 million prisoners for the government to house, clothe, and feed without getting anything in return. Now, while it may be good that convicted criminals can cover some of their own costs, there's also potential for abuse. For example, there are some reports of workers being verbally abused or forced to work extra hours as punishment. Prisoners are also not protected by any labor laws. And the fact that state prison systems now depend on using prison labor can cause issues too. Both Republicans and Democrats have argued that reducing the number of people in prison would reduce a critical labor pool for states. But there are also undeniable benefits to prison labor. Remember that documentary Angola for Life? Angola, the prison farm in Louisiana, was once one of the most violent prisons in the country. The situation got worse after 1994. That's when Bill Clinton, in an attempt to appear tough on crime, signed the Violent Crime Control and Law Enforcement Act. It expanded the death penalty, encouraged states to lengthen prison sentences, and eliminated federal funding for inmate education. Back in the 90s, being tough on crime was the in thing. McGruff the Crime Dog nearly won the primaries. But it turns out longer sentences and fewer chances for education didn't help prisoners in Angola reform. It made things worse. Until Warden Burl Cain came up with an idea: lay off the Twinkies. Also, he promoted jobs in religion. And it worked. The Twinkie thing, not so much.
Why do you think violence has come down in Angola?
When Warden Cain came on the scene, what he did was open up the door of opportunity. He was able to see, if I can get these guys to start coming after success, because what success do, it changed the way you think. If I can achieve something, I feel better about myself.
One thing that made Angola's vocational programs different than most prisons was the warden's focus on improving the morality of the inmates to reduce violence, and his belief that prisons should educate inmates and give them a purpose. In other words, rehabilitation. He also made sure they worked and learned job skills. And the fact that these prisoners only learn how to function in society after being sentenced to prison? The irony is not lost on the warden.
We had to have a victim to send them here and get them prepared to go back out in society and be successful. God help us. Somebody's got to be hurt, murdered, killed before we'll recognize the problem we have and go back and fix it. But in corrections, we didn't do it for so long because we all believed that we were just supposed to lock them up. We forgot corrections means correct deviant behavior.
And that is the core issue. Do prisons exist to punish or to rehabilitate? Depending on your answer, that may affect how you view prison labor and, more broadly, prisoners' rights. How does the government currently view the debate? Hold on to your butts, because this surprised me too. By unanimous consent in 2017, Congress agreed to President Trump's resolution to make April Second Chance Month, to provide opportunities for people with criminal records to earn an honest second chance. Even the ACLU supported Trump on this. That's like PETA saying, "We admit it, sometimes a sandwich just tastes better with bacon." It follows similar statements made by Trump in this year's State of the Union.
This year, we will embark on reforming our prisons to help former inmates who have served their time get a second chance at life.
I mean, it really shouldn't be a surprise, I guess. We all knew Trump believes in second chances, and when it comes to marriages, third chances. So what do you think about prison labor? Is it modern-day slavery or a tool for rehabilitation? Leave your comments below. Don't forget to subscribe for more episodes of America Uncovered. And remember, we're mainly funded by support from viewers like you. So please support us on the crowdfunding website Patreon. Once again, I'm your host, Chris Chappell. Thanks for watching America Uncovered.